Okay, so number 57 on 3.5, they give us the information that sine of alpha divided by 2 is equal to 4/5, and that the angle alpha divided by 2 is in quadrant 2. Since they tell us what the sine of a particular angle is and they tell it what quadrant it's in, I don't think you even need to worry about that it says alpha divided by 2. I think all you have to do, and I could be wrong, are you finding alpha? Oh, you're finding the sine of alpha. Okay, that's different then. Okay, well let's go ahead and sketch where alpha divided by 2, let's sketch a triangle for that. So quadrant 2, so alpha over 2, sine is 4/5, so 4/5. So what would the other piece here be? -3, right? Because it's quadrant 2. So that means that cosine of alpha over 2 would be -3/5. We might need that later. That's another issue that a lot of you had on the retake and on the original test, was keeping track of when to make things negative. Be careful. That seems to be an ongoing problem. Okay. So if we want to find the sine of alpha, what do we have to do to the angle alpha over 2 to find alpha? Careful. Okay. If I know values for alpha over 2 and I want to find values for alpha, what do I do to the angle alpha over 2 to get alpha? I double it. So which identities are you actually using here? Double angle identities. Okay, so if I need to find sine alpha would be the same as sine of 2 times alpha over 2, correct? So it's like a double angle identity. So what's our sine double angle identity? Is it 2 sine alpha cosine alpha normally, right? But in this case we're using alpha over 2 because we're doubling that number to get alpha instead. Do you see how I've adapted the identity with our alpha over 2 instead of x or whatever we talked about originally? Are we okay with how we've adapted the identity? Questions? Anything? Any? Okay, let's go for it. So let's just plug in the right numbers into our identity. So we have a 2. We have sine of alpha over 2, which they told us is 4/5. We have cosine of alpha over 2, which is -3/5. If you do that negative wrong, you'll get the wrong answer. Okay, and since we have fractions here, but this one's not a fraction, we should probably put it over 1 so we don't forget to treat it like a fraction, right? So 2 times 4 is 8 times -3 is -24. And then 5 times 5 is 25. Let me check the answer with my book. That is in fact the correct answer. So now to find the others, you can either draw a new triangle, and if you take an angle that's in the second quadrant and you double it, your angle's going to be between 90 and 180. So what happens if you double the angle 90? It would be 180, which means quadrant 3 perhaps. Or if you double the angle 180, that takes you to 360. So basically, alpha has to be somewhere between quadrant 3 or quadrant 4. All students take calculus. Obviously, sine is negative. But the issue I'm trying to bring up with you here is I just barely said you could probably draw a triangle to find the other angles or the other ratios, but that might not be a good idea because you don't know if it's quadrant 3 or 4. Because you don't know exactly what alpha over 2 is. You just know it's in quadrant 2. And you don't know exactly what alpha is, so you don't know if it's in quadrant 3 or quadrant 4, right? So it's probably best to just keep using identities instead of trying to draw a picture, just so we can make sure we were getting the positives and negatives correct. Okay, so we're supposed to find cosine. So let's go ahead and find a cosine double angle identity. There's like several of them. It doesn't matter which one. So I can't remember. What's the most common one? Is it sine squared minus cosine squared or cosine squared minus sine squared? You guys know which one I'm talking about? cosine squared minus sine squared. There it is. Okay. So we're going to go cosine squared of alpha over 2 minus sine squared of alpha over 2. Okay, so let's plug in the right numbers here. So if we plug in, for cosine, we would plug in -3/5 and square that. And then for sine, we would plug in 4/5 and square that. So that gives us 9/25 minus 16/25, which is -7/25. Okay, now that tells us what quadrant it's in. How does just finding cosine tell us what quadrant it's in? Sine is negative and cosine is negative. What quadrant are both sine and cosine negative in? Both in quadrant 3. So that means that alpha is in quadrant 3. And we know that sine is 24/25 and cosine is 7/25. So now we can just use the picture to find the other stuff if we want. So tangent of alpha would be positive, what, 24/7? Right? Using the picture? Where did I get the picture from? I used the two answers I just got to figure out what quadrant and sketch my picture. So tangent is 24/7. And now how do I find cosecant, secant, and cotangent? Just flip them over. So there's that one. And then cosecant would be -25/24. And then secant would be -25/7. And you're done.